Patch 13.7 is upon us with a massive amount of changes with some nerfs, some buffs, and many item changes too. Starting with the nerfs, the first nerf goes to Annie, whose E's cooldown will now only get half a second faster per rank, and the shield amount is also losing a small chunk of flat rate, making it less desirable to max her E. The next nerf goes to Lee Sin, who's losing 2 base attack damage and 2 base armor. Following this we have Olaf, whose passive attack speed is reduced by 10% early game before scaling back up to 100%. In addition, his Q will now deal 5 less damage at all ranks. The next nerf goes to RAMMUS, whose W's bonus armor will now scale less well with total armor as it's leveled. Following this we have Sejuani, whose passive damage against epic monsters is being reduced down to 250. In addition to this, her Q's cooldown will be 1 second longer at all ranks, and her R's cooldown will be 10 seconds longer at all ranks, giving her smaller windows to play in. Next we have Veigar, who has some massive changes. Firstly, the AP ratio on his Q and W is being drastically decreased at higher levels, but actually slightly higher when fully leveled. In addition, he can no longer place his E in certain terrains to hide it, and his AP ratio on his ultimate is being decreased at the first and second rank. Where his late game's looking slightly better, it was already incredible, and this does really hurt his early game. Following this we have Vi, whose Q will be dealing significantly less flat damage but scale better with AD. In addition, her E will deal significantly less flat damage and also scale better with AD and AP. So essentially, to get the most out of her kit, you're going to want to build more AD. Next we have Wukong, who's losing 2 base attack damage. In addition, his W cooldown will now only get 2 seconds faster each rank, and he's losing 5% of the attack speed on his E at all ranks. And the final nerf goes to ZERI, whose health growth per level is going down from 115 down to 100. Her passive shield absorb is now going down to 45%, and her ultimate damage will now scale less well with AD. The first buff goes to Alistar, who's gaining 3 additional base armor and 15 additional base health. This probably isn't enough to make him meta again, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. The next buff goes to Azir, who's getting 3 additional base armor, and his attack speed growth is being increased up to 6%. Also, his passive turret is being increased by 15 seconds, and the cast range up to 700, making his turret far more useful again. However, his Q will now cost more mana at all ranks, and the stab range is decreased. But they're moving away from the Q max, with his W now dealing additional magic damage per level, and costing less mana as it's leveled. Between the nerfs to Q and the buffs to W, it makes W far more of a desirable choice to now max. Following this, we have Graves, whose crit strike per pellet damage is being increased to 30%, and the cooldown in his ultimate is being greatly decreased at early levels. Next we have Callista, who's getting an additional 0.25 attack damage per level, and they've changed her Black Spear sacrifice to now only last 8 seconds, and she also has to channel it. Following this we have Katarina, whose passive will now scale harder with AP, and her ultimate will now deal slightly less damage but scale harder with attack speed. And the final buff goes to Yasuo, whose passive shield amount will now scale harder with levels, and some interesting changes to his E, which will now get less damage with each stack early game, but can now be stacked up to 4 times for a good amount of additional damage. And finally we have a couple of adjustments to K6's isolation range being buffed down to 375. His W slow when evolved is now not quite so oppressive, but his ultimate will now have a 12-second window to be used in. The other adjustment goes to Thresh, where the Q cooldown refunded on hit will now only be 2 seconds, but combined with his recent buffs, it's an adjustment overall. We have a couple of item changes, with Death Dance giving 10 less damage and 5 less armor, but now giving 15 ability haste. Catalyst will now give 300 health but cost 1300 gold, with Abyssal Mask gaining 50 additional health. In addition, a good quality of life change goes to all Grievous Wounds items, which will now apply the effect even through shields. And we have cool changes to ping, where pings further away out of your screen will now be shown on the edge of your screen instead.